This video was made possible by the people who support me on Patreon. Get early access to all my videos by becoming an OCC Patreon supporter. On January 6, 2021, at the behest of Donald Trump, insurrectionists stormed the United States Capitol building. Spearheading the charge was this man,
for 4 years
referred to as the QAnon shaman. Images and theories about this man blanketed the internet in the days following the attempted coup. Conservatives and Republicans painted him as some kind of paid actor, hippie, climate activist. But these theories were obscuring the truth of who the QAnon shaman really is. A truth that reveals the dark history of environmentalism and a terrifying strain of white supremacist thought that is now growing in far-right circles. This is the story of eco-fascism. In the early 1900s, conservation was taking hold of the American imagination. The forefathers of the early environmental movement, like John Muir, Gifford Pinchot, and Teddy Roosevelt, were carving out wild spaces in the United States for the enjoyment of all Americans. They established the first wilderness area in Yosemite National Park and worked to create policies protecting wild animals. At least, that's how I learned it in school. These men, however, were far from the defenders of life we paint them out to be. In fact, they were pretty much the opposite. John Muir wrote blatantly about his perceptions of the indigenous people of the California's Merced Valley as subhuman, lazy, dirty, and superstitious, and then in the same breath praised the wildlife of Yosemite as divine. Indeed, the very creation and preservation of Muir's Yosemite National Park meant the forced expulsion of Native American communities from the area. But among his contemporaries in the environmental movement, John Muir was sadly the tamest. The head of Theodore Roosevelt's National Conservation Committee, Gifford Pinchot, who many know as the father of conservation, was also a staunch eugenicist. Or in other words, he believed that white people had superior genetic traits and that in order to preserve this genetic superiority, the world needed to forcibly sterilize or kill people of color. And Pinchot wasn't just a closet eugenicist either. This man was a delegate of the First and Second International Eugenics Congress and also a member of the Advisory Council of the American Eugenics Society for 10 years. And then there's Madison Grant. A personal friend of then-President Theodore Roosevelt, Grant actively worked to establish wilderness preservation in the form of Denali National Park, lobbied the New York government to restrict hunting practices, fought the construction of the Hetch Hetchy Dam in Yosemite, and also established the Bronx Zoo. And while he was engaging in these environmental pursuits, Grant was espousing white supremacist and eugenicist views in his notorious 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, which Theodore Roosevelt called a capital book. The tome outlined the superiority of the quote-unquote Nordic race and lamented its supposed decline. Grant was such a white supremacist that Adolf Hitler wrote him a personal letter to tell Grant that his book was his personal Bible. So as environmentalism took shape in the early 20th century, some of its most prominent and powerful advocates were deeply rooted in white supremacist thought, a tradition that continued into the 1960s and 70s. With the publishing of Paul and Anne Ehrlich's Population Bomb in 1968, the United States exploded into a frenzy of fears about overpopulation. The thesis of the book was that societal and environmental collapse were at our doorstep and overpopulation was the driver.
Sometime in the next 15 years, the end will come.
The first page of the book describes a stinking hot night in Delhi wherein people were closely packed together, thrusting their hands through taxi windows, begging, and others were defecating and urinating. But what Ehrlich was seeing was not overpopulation. What he was seeing was gross inequality in a capitalist system. To be quite clear, overpopulation is not the problem. Various studies have shown that the conspicuous consumption of just 10% of the world's population is responsible for 49% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Yet overpopulation quickly took hold as a serious issue, and often the solution mirrored the solutions of Grant, Muir, and Pinchot. Decrease the population of non-white poor people to save wealthy white nations. Indeed, Ehrlich often encouraged sterilization. And American ecologist Garrett Harding outlines this exact argument in his 1974 paper, Lifeboat Ethics. Harding, with prose baked in white supremacy, envisions nations as lifeboats on a planet of dwindling resources. According to Harding, in this scenario, it's morally excusable for rich lifeboats to let those struggling in the water drown. And Harding's views weren't just fringe theories. The 1950s, 60s, and 70s witnessed a slew of forced sterilizations in the majority world. From the sterilization of 1/3 of the women in Puerto Rico to India's mass sterilization program in 1975 that withheld welfare and government benefits to lower caste people who refused sterilization, fear of overpopulation led to sterilization programs often propped up by the United States. And within the United States, the fear of quote-unquote hyperfertility of women of color and concerns about resource depletion meant that from 1970 to 1976, the Indian Health Services sterilized 25 to 42% of indigenous women seeking healthcare. While in North Carolina in the 1960s, 65% of women who were sterilized in the state were black, despite making up only 25% of the population. The point here is this. Although environmentalists sounding the alarm about overpopulation might seem harmless, it is more often than not used as an excuse for eugenics and racist policies. These different strands of white supremacist environmentalism are once again getting pulled from the past and coalescing before our very eyes. In fact, this ideology stormed the halls of Congress during the January 6th insurrection in the form of the QAnon shaman, who, according to a deep dive of his social media page, manifests his eco-fascist worldview through only eating organic food while simultaneously lionizing Nordic culture and Viking paraphernalia. If this sounds familiar, it's because eco-fascists and white supremacists love Madison Grant, the guy who wrote about the decline of the Nordic race. And I'm not just saying this. Anders Breivik, the Norwegian who killed 69 teenagers and 8 adults in a brutal 2011 mass shooting and bombing, quoted Madison Grant's Nordic theory multiple times in his lengthy manifesto. The person responsible for the Christchurch massacre at 2 mosques, a self-described eco-fascist himself, wrote that immigration is environmental warfare and that there is no nationalism without environmentalism. While the El Paso shooter argued that if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can be more sustainable. And decades before these shootings, the infamous Unabomber espoused similar views in his 35,000-word manifesto that argued that industrialization and population were ruining the world. But this extremist thought is also prevalent in the mass media. Fox News anchor Tucker Carlson has spoken multiple times about how a rise in immigration is causing local environmental degradation.
Huge fire breaks out in the Sierras last summer, started inadvertently by an illegal immigrant, and they say literally nothing because their concern for open borders overrides their concern for the environment.
Modern eco-fascism is not anything new. Through lines of white supremacy and racial genocide run throughout the environmental movement's history. Today, as in the past, it's an extremely dangerous trend in the far right. Its ideological subscribers are not using environmentalism to mask their white nationalist and eugenicist ideals. The two inform each other simultaneously, often with the conclusion being that the only way to stop climate change is through brutal violence and draconian eugenics regimes. As climate change gets worse and worse and our global prospects more dire, eco-fascist extremist thought seems to be growing in prevalence among the right. This means that there's a growing battle over what the climate crisis will mean. As Naomi Klein puts it,
are we in the wealthy world going to hoard what is left, lock out everybody else, see this resurgence in these abhorrent ideologies that never went away? Or are we going to recognize that our fates are interconnected?
Our only choice to fight these fascist ideologies is to address climate change in a way that will not only repair the harm of past racist environmental measures, but also re-envision a more equitable and just world. That means seeing the problems of overpopulation for what they really are: failed capitalism and deep-seated racism. Unfortunately, videos like these, while very important, do terribly with the YouTube algorithm and sponsors don't want to touch them. But there is a way you can help. Becoming an OCC Patreon supporter helps Our Changing Climate stay afloat and independent. As an OCC patron, you'll not only gain early access to videos, but also special behind-the-scenes updates and a members-only Discord channel. In addition, each month, my supporters vote on an environmental group that I then donate a portion of my monthly revenue to. Patreon supporters are the financial backbone of the Art-Changing Climate operation. Without them, I wouldn't be able to take creative risks and dive into difficult topics. So if you want to help keep this channel alive or are feeling generous, head over to patreon.com/artchangingclimate or use the link in the description and become an OCC patron. If you're not interested or aren't financially able to, then no worries. You can help the channel out by subscribing, liking the video, and commenting. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you in 2 weeks.